Now, what is cerebrospinal fluid and why do you have it there? Well, it's the fluid that's in the inside and external surfaces of the central nervous system. So you have your ventricles, your central canal, that's on the inside. But remember that subarachnoid space, that's on the outside of your central nervous system. So you have cerebrospinal fluid both inside and outside of your brain and spinal cord. And what does it do? Well, it actually helps shock absorb a bit, but it also helps to kind of. So the thing is that your brain is relative. Again, it's tissue. It's going to have its own weight. Or if you've ever watched like the great in one of those like Food Network or Great British Bake Off, where they make a really huge cake, and the cake is kind of like collapsing on itself because it's so heavy, it starts to squish itself. Well, if you float something like the brain in a liquid, it actually provides buoyancy. So the brain is not going to be crushing its lower parts and inferior parts against its own weight. So it kind of helps to float and cushion it. And the thing is that it's also a circulatory type of circulation as well. So it can deliver nutrients to cells, but also can remove waste from the central nervous system as well. So you have your blood, but you also have your cerebrospinal fluid helping out as well. So again, it's circulation. This is not just their cerebrospinal fluid isn't just sitting there like a still stagnant lake that never moves. It actually has circulation throughout your central nervous system. And actually you can see not well the brain's pretty obvious, but you can also see circulation around the spinal cord as well over here. That's why I love that image. Okay, so how do you make cerebrospinal fluid? Is it just there? Is it just water? Well, the thing is that it's actually made from your blood. So what we have here is a cross section of these vessels right here. And then we have these ependymal cells. So these ependymal cells are all lining this right part right here. So this is produced by filtering plasma. Again, plasma is the liquid portion, the fluid portion of blood. So basically what you do take is the plasma of blood, filter it through all these cells, and eventually you get cerebrospinal fluid. So the first step is actually going past this part we call the blood-brain barrier. Now what do we have here? So this part is called the choroid plexus, and a choroid plexus is a network of these ependymal cells that make CSF. But let's back up a bit. So again, cerebrospinal fluid is derived from blood, but it's filtered through the blood-brain barrier. So we have endothelial cells that line the blood or line blood vessels. We also have pericytes, and I don't think it's actually showing it in this image, but they're there. Then you have astrocytes. So this is the blood-brain barrier, and when you filter the blood through, you have this interstitial fluid. Now, this interstitial fluid is in your cerebrum, among your brain tissue, but it's not quite cerebrospinal fluid yet. So this interstitial fluid filters through more neurons, and then it has to eventually filter through ependymal cells. And these are the ones that actually make the cerebrospinal fluid. So the interstitial fluid is filtered through the ependymal cells, and then it finally becomes cerebrospinal fluid. So the way I like to think of it almost like as a double filtering or a very complex water filter. So you have this complex mixture in blood, but as it gets filtered through more and more of these cells, it ends up becoming a very ultra pure, ultra refined type of water fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. And again, this is another reason why cerebrospinal fluid should be sterile. Because again, if you have any viruses or bacteria, it shouldn't make it all this way through these layers of cells and these ependymal cells, especially this blood-brain barrier. You don't want anything infecting your brain and nervous tissue as well. So that's why if you have an injury to your nervous system or any injury to the blood-brain barrier or any of the cells that protect your nervous system, you can have infections. And this is why, again, cerebrospinal fluid should be sterile. It's an I like to think of it as an ultra filtered type of bodily fluid. And I think I should find an image of it. But if you look at cerebrospinal fluid, you wouldn't be able to tell it visually from water. It's just that pure and clear compared to like plasma and blood. Okay, so then what we have here, so is there just one singular choroid plexus? Well, a choroid plexus is just a grouping of these ependymal cells. So there's actually a choroid plexus in all the ventricles, both lateral ventricles, the third ventricle we see here, yeah, both lateral right there, and the fourth ventricle over there. So these are, again, you have the brain interstitial fluid being derived from blood, And that interstitial fluid is filtered by these ependymal cells to make cerebrospinal fluid. So this cerebrospinal fluid is going to circulate within the brain, but also around the central nervous system as well. Okay, so then I think this is actually a nicer picture from the OpenStax version, because I think it's kind of hard to see the red arrows. I know if you're colorblind, this is brutal, but I have a hard time seeing these red arrows. So I think it's a little better here where you see all the choroid plexuses and they're making cerebrospinal fluid. And notice that it's circulating up and around the brain and around the spinal cord. So it's not only circulating on the inside, it's also circulating on the outside as well. Now, this is down here, so what it's not showing in this part, this is from back to the Martini version, and they're showing this slash because the spinal cord is pretty long, so they're just showing you the end of here, kind of like when they have a graph and they show a break in the graph. But what I'm getting at here is that, again, that cerebrospinal fluid is circulating all along the spinal cord, not only on the inside, but the outside as well. Now, the thing is that, remember how I said those meninges are continuous, but in the brain, it gets a little more complex. So what we have here is the dura mater, but now we have two layers. We have the meningeal layer that's more inner, but against the cranial bone, we have the periosteal layer. So still branches of still part of the dura mater, but now it actually starts to branch off and form these two layers that are still continuous to dura mater, but now it has this extra space. This extra space is called the dural sinus. Now, I like to liken the dural sinus like a gutter. So why do I say it's like a gutter? Well, what do gutters collect on a roof? It collects fluid, right? So the dural sinuses collect cerebrospinal fluid from the central nervous system. But how does it do that? So remember how I said that the subarachnoid space contains that cerebrospinal fluid? So how do you go from the subarachnoid space to this actual dural sinus? Well, there are special structures called arachnoid granulations. And what we see here is that the subarachnoid space, where that has our cerebrospinal fluid, actually goes out, connects here to that sinus via these arachnoid granulations. So now you have cerebrospinal fluid actually going from the subarachnoid space and into the sinus. Now I kind of like in the this little drain here from the gutter down to somewhere else. Where is that somewhere else? Well, the thing is that you have all these sinuses, and actually before we go to where they eventually go, notice that you have something called dural folds. So these are also continuous with the dura mater. So not only do you have the sinuses, the periosteal and the meningeal layer forming that little pocket, you also have these sheets that actually fold it of sheets of dura mater that's in between the hemispheres of the brain. And I believe this might be a sheep brain, but what we have here is that tough dura mater. And we actually have something called the falx cerebri. So falx, I think, comes from a root word meaning sickle. So I think that's why they kind of say it. It's kind of like a sickle here. But what we have here is all that very leathery, tough dura mater. So it also forms another layer here between the hemispheres and also between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. We'll get to those two very soon. But why is it there? Well, it kind of helps to hold these sinuses in place, and also these little these blood vessels. So these sinuses are actually blood vessels, and they actually connect here all the way to down here, and eventually this is where they are actually not down. Yeah. So these blood vessels actually connect all the way here, and then let's go to here. So actually OpenStax has a nice image of this. So what you have, remember, all those arachnoid granulations are taking cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space to those sinuses, and there are many of these sinuses, and this is all that excess, or this is all that cerebrospinal fluid. This is all the cerebrospinal fluid going this way, circulating here, and eventually it goes down to here, and this is where it eventually ends up at the jugular veins. So these are veins in your neck, so these collect all this excess fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, and returns it back to your circulation, your blood. And it actually goes up, or the jugular veins eventually drain into your superior vena cava, if you know what the major vessels of your circulatory system, and it eventually returns to your heart. So I'd like to think of it this way. The sinuses are kind of like the gutter and kind of a drain. So if you have excess fluid in cerebrospinal fluid or in your in your central nervous system, it's going to collect that excess and return it back to your circulation. Because the thing is, like, what happens if you have too much cerebrospinal fluid or too much interstitial fluid or just too much fluid in your brain? Well, the thing is that if you have all that water and fluid in there, it's going to cause pressure on the brain. If all this pressure on the brain, it's going to cause pressure on blood vessels. If you cause pressure on blood vessels, then what happens to the circulation and what happens to the nutrient and oxygen supply to your nervous tissue? Well, no nutrients or oxygen. That causes, like, again, that's going to cause nervous tissue to die. So this is why it's very important to regulate the fluid and pressure in the brain. Hey, remember that thing about talked about cerebral edema? You might want to go back to the lecture if this is all news to you. All right, so actually this is new this year, and this is the way. So remember, cerebrospinal fluid is made from blood. How do you make cerebrospinal fluid? So again, the blood is filtered through that blood-brain barrier, and then it ends up as brain interstitial fluid, but it's not CSF yet. Remember, those cells that are very important in making CSF, those are ependymal cells. So ependymal cells take interstitial fluid from the brain, and then remember, you have these choroid plexuses all over in your each ventricle, and then you have, or actually not all over, but they're in each ventricle. So these ependymal cells, this makes cerebrospinal fluid. So how does cerebrospinal fluid end up backing? So if you have, say you have too much CSF, how do you return it to the body or get rid of it from your brain and central nervous system? Well, you return it to circulation. And how do you return it to circulation? You have those dural sinuses, and eventually it reaches those jugular veins and the superior vena cava. So again, it's all fluid balanced. Again, you don't want to have too little CSF or too much. So how do you make more CSF? Well, go through these steps. And how do you return it back and get rid of excess CSF? Return it back to blood via the dural sinuses and veins.